The first time I camped alone, the forest didn't feel like a friend. It felt alive. And not in the comforting way people describe when they wax poetic about nature. Every sound was sharp-edged. The pop and hiss of my small fire made me flinch. When the sun dipped below the ridge and the woods turned from green to black, I realised how far I was from anyone. The silence between sounds was worse than the sounds themselves. It stretched thin, taut, as if something was holding its breath out there in the dark. I'd picked a small clearing beside a creek, maybe a mile off the trail. The ground was soft with needles, the kind that smell rich and sharp when you crash them. It should have been peaceful. It wasn't. I sat near my tent, watching the last orange light fade through the pines, and told myself I'd be fine. I'd hiked plenty. I'd camped with friends dozens of times, but being alone, really alone, was different. There was no conversation to fill the empty spaces, no laughter to chase away the dark. The first twig snapped not long after I'd crawled into my sleeping bag. My heart leapt into my throat. Then came another, and another. I held my breath, ears straining. A slow shuffle, then stillness. I pictured everything, from a bear nosing through my food bag to something worse, something that didn't belong to any page of a field guide. My hand found the handle of my knife, though I knew it wouldn't do much good. My flashlight felt like a fragile shield, a bubble of light barely strong enough to hold back the night. For a long while I lay there, too afraid to move, eyes fixed on the thin nylon ceiling of the tent. The fabric rippled slightly with every gust. The creek gurgled a few yards away, but even that sound started to feel sinister. I thought about packing up, hiking out, quitting before the fear swallowed me whole. But where would I go? The trail was steep, rocky, and invisible without daylight. I was trapped by my own choices. Eventually, I sat up and unzipped the tent flap just enough to peek out. The moon was rising, pale and ghostly, laying silver stripes through the trees. Nothing moved. No glowing eyes, no hulking shapes. Just the slow, swaying shadows of branches and the whisper of wind. My fear eased a fraction. Each movement, a question. My breath came shallow, as if the air itself had thickened. Something rustled behind the fallen log near the creek. My heart drummed so hard I could feel it in my throat. I clenched my jaw, forcing myself to stay still, to listen. There it was again, a soft shuffle. Then the faint clink of a stone dislodged. Whatever it wasn't rushing toward me. It was just there. I swallowed and whispered under my breath, "It's just an animal. It's just an animal." A breeze slid through the pines, brushing needles together in a low hiss, and for the first time, I heard it properly. The forest wasn't silent. It was layered, alive with small sounds I'd never really listened to before. Insects humming in uneven rhythm, the creek's murmur winding through stones, the groan of a tree shifting under its own age. Even my heartbeat was part of the night's pulse. Minutes passed, maybe hours, I couldn't tell. The fear didn't vanish, but it softened. It became something else, something quieter. Curiosity, maybe. I began to trace each sound, naming it, giving it shape. That scratching? Probably a mouse near my food bag. The soft splash? A frog dropping from a rock into the creek. The faint hoot above? A barred owl, distant and steady. Each identification stripped away a layer of the unknown, and with it, a layer of my fear. When the wind stilled completely, I realized I was shivering. Not from cold, though the air had turned crisp, but from the effort of holding myself so tight for so long. I stretched, let the tension drain from my shoulders, and stepped fully out of the tent. The moon had climbed high, silvering the world in quiet light. My little fire had burned down to a heart of orange coals, and smoke drifted lazily upward. I tossed another stick into the embers, watched the sparks rise like fireflies. The simple motion calmed me. Somewhere out in the dark, a coyote yipped, followed by another farther off. The sound no longer frightened me. It sounded like laughter, flickering amber. Beyond the reach of the light, the forest seemed endless. I thought about how in the city, light spills everywhere, filling every corner. Out here, light was precious, a small, trembling thing that pushed back an ocean of dark. I was the only one awake for miles, a tiny keeper of that fragile flame. After a while, I decided to walk just beyond the circle of light. My boots sank softly into the pine needles. The air smelled faintly of smoke and earth. The trees stood tall and ancient, their branches heavy with the night. My heartbeat was loud in my ears again, but it wasn't panic now. It was awareness. Every sense alive, every sound distinct. I crouched beside the creek. The water glinted faintly, silver in the moonlight, and moved in slow swirls around smooth stones. Kneeling there, I realized how small my fear had been compared to the world's quiet persistence. Everything around me kept living, utterly indifferent to whether I was afraid or not. That realization felt strangely comforting. I filled my water bottle, watched it ripple under the surface, and in that instant I saw movement, a small shadow darting along the opposite bank. My pulse spiked, but then the shape emerged. A deer, thin and graceful, picking its way down to drink. Its ears twitched toward me, but it didn't run. The two of us just stood there, sharing the same patch of moonlight, both alert, both alive. It drank for a few moments, lifted its head, and slipped back into the trees. I exhaled slowly, realizing I'd been holding my breath. That little encounter felt like a reward, proof that the night wasn't waiting to harm me, just waiting for me to listen. Back at camp, the fire had burned low again. I let it fade, lying on my back beside it, wrapped in my sleeping bag. Through the canopy, stars shimmered, clearer and sharper than I'd ever seen them. They seemed impossibly close, as though the night sky itself leaned down to keep me company. Stretched, there were now ferns and moss and low shrubs glistening with dew. The same trees that had loomed like giants in the dark now stood calm and stately, their trunks catching the first blush of gold. I realized then that nothing had changed but me. The forest hadn't become less mysterious, only less misunderstood. I walked down to the creek and splashed cold water on my face. It shocked me awake, sent a thrill through my chest. My reflection shimmered in the current, eyes a little red, cheeks smudged with ash, but smiling. I couldn't help it. I'd done it. I'd spent the night alone, terrified and trembling, and somehow made it through. I'd faced every imagined creature that crept out of my mind and found them all to be just that, imagination. I brewed a small cup of coffee over what embers I could coax back to life. The smell filled the clearing, rich and grounding. The first rays of sunlight broke through the treetops, setting the mist aglow. It was like watching the world be born again, every leaf touched with gold. Birds began to stir, one warbler, then another, until the whole forest seemed to hum with life. The same sounds that had unnerved me hours before now felt like a greeting. I sat there with my cup warming my hands, watching the light climb higher. The longer I looked, the more I realized how much I'd missed when fear had ruled my senses. The forest wasn't empty or threatening, it was alive with detail. A spider's web glittering with dew. The slow drift of smoke from my dying fire. The ripple of fish beneath the surface of the creek. It struck me then how easily the mind can turn wonder into danger, how darkness can twist beauty into threat. All it had taken to break that spell was time. One long, sleepless night spent listening instead of running. When I finally packed up my gear, the sunlight had reached full strength. My tent dried quickly in the warmth. I cinched the last strap on my pack and took one last look at the clearing. It seemed smaller now somehow. Familiar. Like a place I'd always known but hadn't truly itself was walking with me instead of watching me. I stopped often, something I rarely did before, to really see the world around me. I noticed things I'd overlooked. The way morning light caught the tips of the grasses. How the bark on an old oak peeled like parchment. How the air cooled slightly near a bend where the creek curved close. The forest had been the same all along. I was the one who'd changed. Where I'd once heard threat in every sound, I now heard life. Where I'd seen darkness, I now saw depth. About halfway back, I paused at a ridge where the trees thinned and I could look out over the valley. The mist had lifted, leaving a patchwork of green and gold rolling out beneath me. For a long while I just stood there, breathing it in. The fear I'd felt that night seemed distant, almost unreal. But I didn't want to forget it either. It had been part of the lesson, one I'd earned, not read about or heard in someone else's story. I thought about how many times I'd told myself I couldn't do something simply because it scared me. That night alone in the forest had stripped that excuse away. Fear wasn't a wall, it was a doorway. It didn't disappear. I just learned to walk through it. When I finally reached the trailhead, the sunlight was high and warm. My car sat where I'd left it, a strange, civilized shape among the trees. I set my pack down on the tailgate and turned back for one last look. The forest stood silent and vast, but not empty. It was full of memory now. Mine. As I drove away, dust rising behind me on the dirt road, I felt a calm I'd never known before. That night hadn't been easy. It had been long, hard, and full of shadows. But it had given me something precious. The courage to sit with fear and see it for what it really was. The edge of discovery. And ever since that night, whenever I step into the wilderness, I greet the darkness like an old friend, because I know now that it's never trying to scare me. It's just waiting for me to listen.